Well, welcome and thank you very much for having me here. I'm delighted to see so much interest in foreign affairs, so much interest in U.S. foreign policy and U.S. relations in this important region. As you heard from the various experiences that I've had professionally, they've always been focused on Latin America, on understanding U.S.-Latin America relations, understanding the way it is seen from Latin America. And for that reason, whenever I can, I try to travel and not just speak to you, but listen to you as well. And so I look forward to your questions and to a conversation after I give a little bit of my perspective, in particular on this one aspect of U.S. relations in Latin America, which is the question of China. This wasn't chosen randomly, as you'll see in this presentation. This has become a guiding principle of the way the United States and to some degree Western Europe views the relationships with Latin America. And so I do think whether or not that's the most useful framing for how the United States engages in this region, I think it's essential to understand that has become a driving force when understanding the place of Latin America in the broader foreign policy considerations and priorities of the United States. And so that's why I think it's important for us to understand the roots of that perspective, the way it shapes a lot of the U.S. approach, and how that might affect the way countries in the region make decisions about the relationship with China and how to navigate amid great power competition. Great power competition is the polite way to describe the rivalry between the United States and China. Sometimes it's useful not to mention particular names, and so we like to say great power competition. But you know what I'm talking about. So, as I've just suggested, the concerns about China, and I'll go into a bit of the history of why these concerns have become so predominant in the way the United States thinks about the region. But I think it's undoubted right now that it is a major and bipartisan consideration for the national security and foreign policy communities in the United States. I want to start by undermining my own argument because I think it's important not to exaggerate this one aspect of U.S. foreign policy. I've just suggested that it is a guiding principle, that it is the new paradigm, that it is the major way that the United States and Europe, to a large degree, see the relationships in Latin America. I want to say why that's not true for a few minutes. So I think we have a fuller understanding of how the United States thinks about this region, but I promise we'll get back to China in short order. So for domestic political reasons, U.S. relations with Cuba and the Caribbean and with Venezuela, and to a lesser degree with Nicaragua, are quite prominent. This includes in the debates in the United States Congress over U.S. Latin America policy, but also in the way the White House and the State Department think about U.S. relations in the region. Mexico is always the most important partner to the United States in Latin America. This has nothing to do with China, but has everything to do with geography, with economic integration between the United States and Mexico, with migration and security considerations, with history. And so I think it's really important never to minimize that when trying to understand what the United States thinks of when it looks south of its own borders. And then there's the broader question of migration and the way that drives U.S. attention to Latin America. You'll often hear complaints that in recent years, or maybe for a very long period of time, the United States has not been thinking much about the Western Hemisphere. This is a major exception to that. And that particularly over the last 2 years, the enormous increase in migration to the United States has forced the U.S. Congress, the White House, and other parts of the U.S. government to think about how to address these levels of migration, and also what are the causes of migration, and how could the United States play a role in addressing some of the reasons, often referred to as the root causes, that so many Latin Americans are leaving their homes. And this is not merely a Central America question. If you look at the most recent data, you're seeing enormous numbers of Cubans, Haitians, Venezuelans coming to the United States as well. And so this is a very broad question that brings up a lot of issues in the region that then rise up the list of U.S. priorities, because this really is a crisis at the United States southwest border. And again, the politics of Latin America, the politics of U.S. foreign policy, there's sometimes a term known as intermestic issues. These are international and domestic issues that meet. And it means that there is some domestic constituency, there are elected officials, there are reasons why some foreign policy issues become more politically sensitive. And Venezuela, I think, is a very good example of that. It's hardly the only one. Cuba is the most famous one, but I just give you this example because it's recent, as the United States has very tentatively engaged with the government in Venezuela. It has generated this really fierce reaction among some very influential members of the United States Congress of both parties. So, I've showed you some responses from a prominent Republican senator. This was a statement from a prominent Democratic senator, also very critical and cautious about this re-engagement. Here was a letter from a group of Democratic members of Congress from Florida, you might have guessed from where, reacting to the re-engagement in Venezuela. And so just to tell you that there are foreign policy issues in Latin America, and maybe predominantly in Latin America, that do have the domestic political content. And so to truly understand the U.S. approach, you have to understand a little bit about the U.S. economic system, the U.S. electoral system, the influence of certain immigrant communities, to really understand sort of how and why certain foreign policy decisions are made regarding Latin America. And then when you look at the sort of senior officials in the U.S. government and the way they engage in Latin America, again, you do see that China is not the exclusive issue. And indeed, for the vice president of the United States, who to some degree has some responsibility in her portfolio for Latin America, you've seen a lot of attention to the so-called Northern Triangle of Central America. These are the countries of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, and looking at the so-called root causes of migration. And that opens up a very broad U.S. engagement because the root causes are quite broad. And they include lack of educational opportunities, violence, corruption, and so, the impacts of climate change, hunger, the intensification of storms. You can tell that opens a very broad series of U.S. engagements that mostly have nothing to do with China. And these issues are becoming even more prominent as we approach the midterm elections in the United States next month, where issues related to the U.S. border become much more prominent. And when there's chaos and crisis at the border, it becomes a bigger political issue that requires a lot more of a U.S. response and U.S. strategic thinking. And so you'll hear, again, a lot of discussion of at least part of Latin America unrelated to our theme for today, which is China. Just to give a sense of what's happening at the border, these are the latest statistics that I could find, but you see, 235,000, 241,000, just extraordinary numbers of Latin Americans mostly arriving at the U.S. border. And the fact that this group is much more diverse has, again, compelled a much more diverse conversation about what are the problems happening in this region that we see so many, again, Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, Haitians, Cubans, and of course the traditional migrants from southern Mexico and from parts of Central America. And so this does push, I think, a healthy debate that's more diverse and more dynamic than the merely China-focused conversation that we are admittedly going to have here shortly. But the migration crisis, for all the problems and all of the human tragedy involved, I think has forced some part of the U.S. foreign policy community to realize how grave a lot of the challenges are in much of Latin America right now, as illustrated vividly by the diverse and large flows of migrants that are coming to the United States. And again, this is unusual, I should point out. It used to be that I think it was something like 5% of the migrants arriving were from anywhere other than Northern Central America and Mexico when you look at Latin American arrivals, and now it's like 40%. And so it's a huge shift. Haitians coming from Chile who left Haiti, after the earthquake several years ago and are now finding their way up. Cuba at numbers we haven't seen in decades. And so, again, a very geographically diverse and very large group of migrants coming. And so there's also sort of thematic issues that drive U.S. engagement in Latin America that I think are worth acknowledging. And these are issues that are less realpolitik. These are not the issues where you can see the impact at the U.S. border. These are more values-driven issues, I'd say. These are issues that are seen sort of long-term and reflecting U.S. principles of its foreign policy. And these include, above all, the defense of democracy, the defense of human rights, and the fight against corruption. And there were two speeches last year that the U.S. Secretary of State delivered, one virtual to the Organization of American States, the other delivered on a trip to Ecuador and Colombia, that I think give a little sense of, again, why there is some interest that's more thematic, and that goes well beyond any particular challenge or any particular foreign actor in the region. One of them is this notion that democracy is under attack in Latin America. And I think U.S. foreign policy right now is very much aware and driven by the idea that Latin Americans, and again, I'm speaking very broadly here, have lost faith in democratic institutions. And it isn't merely, though this is severe enough, that there are leaders in Latin America that themselves are undermining democratic institutions, but that Latin Americans have decided that these institutions do not deliver the kinds of quality of life, safety, security, decent public services, health, and education that was promised. And so you have communities in Latin America much more open now to alternative political models, to political figures who are less interested in democratic norms, in elections, the balance of power systems, and are more interested in promising solutions to some of these very legitimate public demands and grievances. And we've seen that manifested in the arrival of certain populist figures who come in and have an agenda that's quite hostile at times to democracy, but also in these social explosions that we've seen in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Chile in recent years that have expressed this rejection of traditional political parties and politics as usual that have reflected, I think, a declining sense of confidence. And so you hear the American Secretary of State saying people living in democracies in this region, it doesn't feel like government is doing enough to address the biggest problems they face. So here's an acknowledgement that it isn't sufficient to talk to the region and now in the United States to speak to ourselves about the importance of democratic institutions in and of themselves and these values. I say in the United States because I acknowledge there's democratic backsliding occurring in the United States as well, and a deterioration in the quality of U.S. democratic institutions. But to say to the U.S. public and to say to Latin American publics that these democracies are not delivering, and so we need to recognize that unless they show their value, it would be very difficult to generate broad social acceptance of these democratic norms. And so we see this again. We watch with alarm as democratically elected leaders have used the powers of the state to undermine democratic institutions. So I would say these are two big threats to democracy that are very much shaping U.S. diplomacy right now, including in Latin America. And again, those are a lack of support for democratic institutions or lack of a sense of their legitimacy, and leaders themselves who are attacking democracy. And of the many pieces of evidence one could point to, I just give you the Latino Barometro recent polling that shows a really stunning decline in support. This is sort of one of the most common basic measures, just asking, is this the political system you want? Is this the best political system that we can consider for your country? A decline from 63% to 49%, so less than half, saying that this is the preferred political system. Now, if you look a little deeper into this data, you're not finding people, and you can see even here, who are interested in authoritarian systems as the alternative. So if you look at that green line there, you don't find growing support for dictatorship. What you find is declining support for democracy and increasing support for giving up, throwing up one's hands and saying, that it's all the same to me. None of it delivers for my family the basic services that are needed to have a decent life. And again, the corruption piece remains very important. Corruption seen by many in the foreign policy community in the United States as kind of the root of all evil, as not kind of immoral in and of itself, but as something that allows for a lot of other social ills, poor governance, poor quality of infrastructure, attacks on the poor and everyone who needs to pay a bribe, lower quality public services because the decisions are made not based on the best use of public funds, but on the company that can pay the largest bribe. And this is not just in Central America. We've seen with the Odebrecht investigation in Brazil, the extent and geographic reach of corruption at a high level. And so the idea that, the imposition on foreign investment, the broad impacts that corruption can have in slowing economic growth and development and improving governance in Latin America. So this is, again, another quite important issue. And the last one I'll point to, unrelated to China, is the Summit of the Americas, which was very recent. It just took place in June. The United States was the host for the first time since the early 90s. And so because of that, the whole U.S. foreign policy community had to get together and say, okay, what is our strategy toward Latin America? What are the most important components? The president, the secretary of state, many ministers, members of the cabinet were traveling to Los Angeles. It was a moment that forced the community in the U.S. to say, okay, what is in it for us in Latin America? What can we contribute to Latin America? And it certainly was not a discussion about China. It was a much broader conversation that looked at public health and economic recovery and migration. It looked at supply chains. It looked at this whole series of issues that are priorities for the United States in the region that can help shape the U.S. thinking. And the themes were, again, varied, but they addressed migration and sustainable and economic recovery and a lot of what I've just described as broader U.S. priorities in its engagements in the Western Hemisphere. And again, there's other signs that the U.S. prioritizes this region and not for merely great power competition. The U.S. vaccine diplomacy, though slow out of the gate, I think has ramped up, and a majority of U.S. donated vaccines have ended up in Latin America. Just another sign of where Latin America kind of fits in the foreign policy hierarchy and how the United States has engaged in broad ways in the Western Hemisphere. And now, as promised, China. So in spite of everything I've just said, and I think it was a reasonable argument, I hope you agree, that there are other issues, and truly that is the case, that Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela, migration, corruption, democratic backsliding, the Summit of the Americas, all of it is important to the United States, all are part of the U.S. approach to the region. I think two things are also true. One is that the United States does not pay enough attention to Latin America, a chronic issue for many years and across presidents of both political parties, something that I argued in a New York Times op-ed not long ago when the Secretary of State was traveling to Ecuador and Colombia. That's getting worse because of complexities many places in the world, depriving Latin America of the kind of attention and resources that it may have received otherwise. The war in Ukraine being a key driver right now of U.S. foreign policy, of congressional action, of U.S. foreign affairs spending, and to some degree also siphoning diplomatic resources, even that are dedicated supposedly to Latin America, by making the job of a U.S. diplomat in Latin America to convince Latin American governments to take certain positions related to this war, versus having conversations with those governments about any number of issues that I've just laid out. And so for a variety of reasons, this relatively low but stable level of attention for the region is arguably even less because of a very complicated world right now, and in particular because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And also I should note, because it's not been easy to marshal support in Latin America for the U.S. and European position on that invasion. Because the United States, I think, has encountered, arguably to me, a surprising amount of resistance to having basic condemnation in Latin America of the invasion and a coordinated and stronger response to encourage an end to this violence and consequences for Russia for this attack. And so you've seen just an example of a resolution that ultimately did pass earlier this year in the Organization of American States with a fairly strong condemnation of Russia. But if you look at it, lots of important abstentions if you look at the pink color here. And so Russia has found Latin America a place of great neutrality when it comes to the war, of so-called non-alignment, or even in some important cases of support for its invasion of Ukraine. And so this has complicated U.S. diplomacy in Latin America, and again, forced U.S. diplomats to spend a lot of time and energy on issues that were not part of those kind of core priorities that I described earlier that were guiding U.S. engagement in the Western Hemisphere. And then there's China as another major, or maybe the major, guiding force, pushing U.S. attention and shaping U.S. priorities and motivating the way the United States operates in the Western Hemisphere. I'm going to describe that without passing judgment on it, at least initially, but we can talk in our questions about whether this is a useful approach diplomatically for the United States, whether this is what the Latin Americans want to hear from us, whether this is even the most effective way to focus on China by focusing on China, or whether you can more effectively compete by not mentioning China in every engagement and not being so obvious about China as this organizing principle. We can talk about that later. Right now, I just want to express what's happening, and I think it's important to understand it and recognize the scale of this change in great power competition and in geopolitics and where Latin America fits in. And then I promise later we can talk about tactics and whether this makes sense, even if this is your objective. Partly, this is a reality based on China's extraordinary growth and influence in this region. I'm giving you here just some basic data from 2007 on cumulative Chinese investment just from the state entities in China. So this doesn't capture a lot of other types of investment from private and quasi-private sector entities in China, but a large investment in the biggest economies in Latin America, and with it, not surprisingly, an increase in influence from China, an increase in China's presence here, an increased diplomatic role in the region. The United States is reacting to this, and I don't think it has invented this phenomenon. And this is particularly true where we're sitting and standing right now in South America, where the commodity exporters have not only been big recipients of this Chinese infrastructure finance, but have had great access to the Chinese market and become increasingly dependent on China as a trading partner. And so the United States, recognizing this, has pivoted, at least in terms of its instrumentalities, in terms of the tools that it has, to think about ways to have a bigger presence here in the areas where it matters most to the governments in Latin America. And above all, that's infrastructure finance. That's providing capital to a region that is scarce in the capital needed to invest in pretty basic infrastructure to improve economic competitiveness. And so you think of things like highways and ports and railways, all of the areas where it's generally been for the last few years, China showing up with major multi-billion-dollar investments and often the ability to carry out these projects as well. So a few years ago, the United States Congress passed the so-called BUILD Act, which a variety of objectives were listed, but the sort of subtext, or maybe even the headline, was to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative of China and to become more nimble and more generous with U.S. finance to try to offer alternatives to China in places like Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Colombia, and throughout the region. Much more recently, last year, the G7 came up with this new initiative then titled Build Back Better World. The name has changed, as we'll discuss in a minute, but the goal is similar to the BUILD Act just in the United States. Again, to generate more capital, better coordination among Western democratic countries, to go to places like Latin America, and to offer developing countries alternative sources of finance. And lately, right after the Summit of the Americas, just this Northern Hemisphere summer, Southern Hemisphere winter, you had this announcement of this Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. It's the same thing as the Build Back Better World. It's motivated by the same goal as this BUILD Act I referenced, all to say that the United States is recognizing that this great power competition is occurring and that the tools that China has wielded are tools that so far the West has not had access to, even though the West presumably has enough wealth and capacity to be able to compete similarly in some of these critical areas. We could talk about why the West, despite the scale of its economies, actually has some structural impediments that make it difficult to compete in a level playing field with China in some of these key areas. But I mention these new tools to show that there is this acknowledgement that this is where the battle is taking place and that you can't really compete unless there's some alternative offer available. And so we've seen in other ways as well this kind of very high-level attention to China issues here. We've not only seen these new tools, but we see now, and it's almost become a cliche, that when U.S. figures come, and this is true often with Europeans as well, they talk about China, China, and China. And if anything else kind of sneaks its way onto the agenda, it's somehow framed to be focused as well on great power competition or U.S. apprehensions about China here. And if you have any candid conversations with diplomats from the region or members of government, they're too polite to complain about it. But it's tiresome, I think, and you have to acknowledge that they sort of sit down and anticipate that any request they have is going to be framed as something useful to the United States and having the United States have a new tool in supplanting China in whatever area of economic or commercial relations there is. And so I give this example because this was a very high-level visit of President Biden's national security advisor. And if you just want to Google the headlines that emerged from these visits to Argentina and Brazil, Huawei 5G technology, and conversations about why that's of a concern to the United States were the major conclusions from those conversations. So what are the concerns, right, specifically when the United States thinks about China and Latin America? Why is it so worried? Why are the Western Europeans so worried? I put them into these categories, although these are very broad categories. Investment in the Belt and Road Initiative, principally that the Chinese are here, and through these investments, we'll talk a little bit about the nature of these investments themselves, but generally speaking, through these investments, gaining a lot of influence. Trade, the market access to China, the fact that countries like Uruguay depend now so much on Chinese purchases of beef and other commodities, had given China a lot of influence, a lot of access, the opportunity to weaponize that market access, which we've seen in the way China has tried to punish Australia for Australia's reactions to the pandemic and China's mishandling of the early period of the pandemic. Its punishment of Lithuania and other countries that get out of line. Its punishment of Paraguay in terms of access to vaccines. So trade as a source of influence for China. Military cooperation. This is the increase of Chinese presence selling materiel in Latin America and also training, having cooperation, a bigger presence in Latin American ports of Chinese ships. Taiwan, where it has the majority of its remaining diplomatic allies, its formal diplomatic partners are in Latin America. The Asian Infrastructure Bank and other sources, new sources of capital that again bind countries in this hemisphere to China. And then telecommunications in particular as an area of immense concern from a national security perspective of the United States. And so these are kind of the broad categories when the United States looks at China here and starts to think about why is this a problem? Why does it matter that this adversarial authoritarian country is gaining influence in an area of strategic and geographic importance in the United States? Well, it happens through these general areas, and this is what generates a lot of worry. Now, the intensity of the U.S. concern about China is different, but the general kind of sense of concern about it is not new and has been around for my time working in the U.S. government, at the State Department and the Treasury, and in the National Security Council staff. And I would lay it out in kind of these general areas, although some of these I should acknowledge are now seem a little bit old-fashioned or a little bit anachronistic, right? Because China has adapted as well and has changed over time in the way it relates to the region. But I think it's good to know kind of the evolution of these concerns, right? There was the basic concern that's mercantilist, right? The basic concern of it's competing with U.S. businesses, right? It's taking opportunities from U.S. companies. And like any country, this would be a concern to the United States, right? We don't like to acknowledge that. We like to say, no, we're happy to compete with anyone. But one of the concerns is that the Chinese companies are coming in and taking opportunities that maybe would have gone to U.S. firms. There's a concern for the economic development interests of Latin America, and I think this is a concern shared by many parts of the region, which is the idea that China is coming in with an interest in particular sectors, mostly commodities, investing mostly in infrastructure to facilitate the export of those commodities, and so pulling labor and capital away from more dynamic sectors in Latin America. And so this is the idea of recommoditization or deindustrialization that you might have heard about in your studies. And this, I would say, is a shared concern in the region. The idea that with this type of economic engagement with China, it deepens the region's historical dependence on its commodity sector. There's the concern that China, by the nature of its government and system, is non-transparent. And so being non-transparent makes it very difficult even for transparent democratic partners to sometimes understand what agreements their own governments are signing with China. And so this can breed corruption in places that don't have very good controls in place. And so maybe a country can do a good job in making sure the agreements are all very public, but often the Chinese have a preference for non-transparency, or at minimum are very happy to kind of meet governments where they are. And so if you're a government that's not interested in transparency, lo and behold, the Chinese will not compel you in the way the World Bank might, or the Inter-American Development Bank, or the US government. The Chinese will be happy to kind of meet you where you are, have agreement completely in privacy, and this, as you could guess, in the hands of some governments, can facilitate corruption and worsen it. There's historically concerns from the United States about environmental protection, the idea that the Chinese are disinterested in protecting the environment where they operate. And so again, if you're a Latin American government that's also disinterested, or you're interested on paper but don't have maybe the capabilities of enforcing your environmental laws, or you're concerned about jeopardizing investment from China, by enforcing your environmental rules, you may end up with some consequences that are negative for the natural spaces in your country. And the same is true for labor laws that the Chinese. Now, again, some of this I would argue has changed over time. China is not imposing the same degree of requirement of Chinese labor, the quality, which I can mention later. There were questions about the quality of Chinese infrastructure. I think that has changed over time as China has become more knowledgeable, more sophisticated in the way it operates overseas. But these have been concerns from very early on. And then this question of debt trap diplomacy, which is a very controversial term, I think fundamentally a flawed concept, because it suggests that China wants countries to default, that it loans money to countries hoping they can't pay it back, and that in defaulting on China, China gains access to the asset as a forfeited asset or some control over the politics. I think China engages in debt trap diplomacy by accident because it has been amateurish in the ways it has engaged, and it has excessively lent money to governments for projects that weren't productive. And now when the governments can't pay it back, it puts China in a very difficult situation. This is sometimes known as a creditor trap instead of a debt trap, where China finds itself, particularly in Venezuela, even in Ecuador right now, sort of stuck. And it doesn't really have a lot of experience renegotiating its debt. It's not part of the Paris Club of industrialized countries that have a more institutionalized system. It likes to think of itself as a poor developing country, but now suddenly it's being seen as a rich lending country. And so for a lot of reasons, I think debt trap diplomacy as a concept is flawed. But the debt is real. And so, concern of the United States historically, and particularly under the last U.S. administration, is that Latin America and other regions have taken on excessive debt because China is not interested in its sort of South-South approach in lecturing about debt sustainability or macroeconomic stability or deficits. And so if countries want to borrow, China will lend. And that has generated some real debt hangovers that I think are problematic for your generation when thinking about what you'll inherit from some of these relationships with China. And again, Ecuador and Venezuela are good examples of this, but they're hardly the only ones. And so there's also this question of whether China kind of overpromises, that China is sort of notorious for announcing the same agreements over and over again over many years. And often these grandiose projects just don't happen. This is hardly China's fault exclusively. This has to do with grandiose Latin American visions for big infrastructure that end up generating a lot of social and environmental opposition and political opposition. But it's an important concept, the idea that engaging with China sometimes you'll generate kind of expectations that wouldn't be met. And then again, just this sort of fundamental idea that the nature of the country that's engaging in all of this, right? That this isn't just Germany or France and the United States sort of jealous of a new player that's succeeding in a region that the United States once dominated economically and diplomatically, but the nature of the country that is having this success. And I think it's important to say, as impolite and undemocratic and undiplomatic as it is, that again, this is a country that's authoritarian, a country with a very aggressive posture toward a democratic neighbor, Taiwan, that has threatened and seems to be preparing for an invasion of the nature and consequences we've seen in Europe in recent months. A country that's abusive of civil liberties and human rights in China, that has destroyed the democracy in Hong Kong and is committing what is often referred to as a genocide of a Muslim Chinese community in Xinjiang. And has taken similar steps in Tibet. And so again, I think sort of understanding the nature of this adversary also helps you understand how it's seen in the United States. And the reason I list all that is not simply to attack China for, I think, justifiable reasons, but to understand the way the United States sees China. Because it's easy to see it as a more kind of neutral actor when you're in a country that is generally focused on the economic necessities in fragile economic moments. And I think a lot of Latin America understandably looks at China as this critical economic partner, and for a variety of reasons doesn't focus on that list that I just gave. Not because necessarily there isn't knowledge or appreciation of it, but it's a little harder to focus on ideas like human rights and democracy when you're living in a much more fragile economic moment. And so I think for a variety of reasons, some ideological, some economic, some political, we sometimes lose sight in these conversations about China of the nature of the Chinese dictatorship. And I think at minimum, it's important to understand how China is seen from the United States when understanding why the United States is so obsessed with China in all the ways that I've just described. And I think the last thing I would say about concerns about China and the way it engages in the region is what I've hinted at earlier about transparency and corruption, which is what I consider Chinese agnosticism about regime type. Which is to say, China is not trying to create a communist party in every country it operates in, or even to come to Uruguay and Chile, places where there is a communist party, and to say, okay, that's the party we want to work with. I would say what China does is a status quo partner, which is to say, if it finds a brutal dictatorship in Caracas, then the brutal dictatorship in Caracas is China's friend in Caracas. If Brazil elects a far-right president, then China's friend in Brasilia is a far-right president, right? If China comes to Uruguay and the Frente Amplio loses and a center-right party comes in, then China is happy to work with that party. Now that sounds nice, right? Less ideological, more flexible, the kind of partner you want, who's just meeting you where you are.
Saudi Arabia.
In terms of?
Saudi Arabia.
And U.S. for the United States. We can talk about the way the United States interacts. And I'm happy to engage on that as well. But what I think is important to say about the Chinese approach is that it's not convenient if you're a political prisoner in Nicaragua, if you're tortured in Venezuela, if your government is borrowing billions and stealing hundreds of millions. Then it's less convenient that China becomes this major partner to your government. And so what I would say is that kind of agnostic approach of the Chinese is very attractive to governments of all stripes. The fact that there's less conditionality in the Chinese approach to lending is very convenient. The fact that China doesn't lecture governments about how it should spend this money or what it should do with its macroeconomics is very convenient, very attractive. The kind of what's known as sometimes patient capital of China, the idea that it will invest in things that don't seem of sort of short-term profitability, all of that can be put to good use, but it can also have negative consequences in a region that occasionally has problematic leadership. And that leadership, when Western Europe, the United States, even other countries in Latin America are trying to isolate it or nudge it in better directions, when it has this key new international partner providing lots of support, it makes it much more difficult to nudge a country in what would be, I think, widely considered a better direction in terms of human rights and economic management. And so how has the United States kind of engaged and learned from these kind of concerns and helped shape U.S. policy toward China? What I would argue is that it wasn't always what it is now. That even though I've said these concerns to different degrees and with different intensity have been around for a long time, there was a period where the United States still, despite it all, looked at China as a potential useful partner in Latin America and never thought about kind of this decoupling notion or you're with the United States, or you're with China, or you're in a divided world. I think there was sort of a long period of the United States learning as well what coexistence with China would look like in places like Latin America, and whether China could have a net positive impact in a place like Latin America. And I would say some of that thinking still exists, but to a much lesser degree. But an acknowledgement that this is a region scarce in infrastructure, for example, and so that Chinese capital could be put to really good use. That China had become an essential partner, trading partner, and source of investment, and that was and remains a reality. And so whatever the United States might want, this is the reality in the region right now. And so acknowledging it seemed rational, and I think to some degree still is. And that again, that the Chinese, as consumers of Latin American exports, particularly in South America, China is a big competitor to manufacturers throughout Latin America, and principally in Central America and the Caribbean. But for commodity exporters, that it's this huge market, and again, that's a reality that gradually I think has been acknowledged, will not change. The United States, which produces many of these same sources of exports, is not going to be the major market for beef and wheat and soy. And so this acknowledgement, I think, has been around for a while, and I think used to have more weight in arguments about how China and the United States could coexist in this region. And I think we've actually learned about China's importance even more lately as China's importance to some degree has declined because state-to-state lending has declined in recent years from China. And Chinese economic decline has also sort of reinforced this argument that China is very important to the region and that needs to be acknowledged as kind of a permanent aspect of Western Hemisphere geopolitics. And again, you've seen, because of the consequences of this sharp decline in recent years of Chinese investment in the region, and the decline of Chinese demand for some products from the region, perversely, it's kind of been the reminder of its importance, right? Because of the economic headwinds that has represented. And as well, kind of as these have had some impact on Chinese, I think, reputation in the region, and the style of Chinese diplomacy. For all these reasons, again, I think the U.S. has become even more cognizant of the way that China is now this essential actor in the Western Hemisphere. And so I think the way that the thinking in the United States has evolved is that these long-term considerations have outweighed lately the sense of China as a potentially helpful partner in Latin America. And with different, I think, levels of nuance, right? I think there is a different level of nuance in the current president, who I'll talk about. There was a different level of nuance in the 8 years of the Obama administration in terms of ways that Latin American governments might productively engage with China, but ways that Latin American governments might want to engage with some greater caution. And there was some less nuance in the last period, in the 4 years of the Trump administration, where I think in the areas where the United States was engaging on China, there was a much more kind of black and white picture. But all of it comes from the same roots and analytical conclusions that I've just explained to you and that I think are helpful analytically for you to keep in mind when thinking about and understanding why the United States engages in the way it does. I'll lay a few of them out before turning to your questions. One of them I mentioned in passing is Taiwan. The United States, for a variety of reasons, has taken on Taiwan's cause in Latin America as its own. And so when it thinks about relationships in Latin America with Taiwan, and that includes Paraguay, it thinks a lot about the importance of defending the interests of Taiwan here and working with countries to show value in that relationship. 8 of Taiwan's remaining 14 diplomatic partners are in this region. This is particularly true about telecommunications as a sector. There's just certain kinds of infrastructure, and this is one of them, that are considered highly sensitive right now by the United States. And we can talk about some of the reasons why. But these are areas where if you think about the United States, particularly amid all the considerations of China in this region, which are the ones that really matter and the essential core of U.S. fears of China's presence here, you'll find quickly that you're talking about telecommunications. You'll think about talking about formal ways to measure Chinese relationships and what countries are signing the different formal partnerships with China, who's joining the Belt and Road Initiative, and when and in what sequence. These are metrics that have become more important to the United States in trying to kind of measure the advancement of China in the region and how the United States is winning or losing this great power competition. And generally it's losing, I think, by almost any of these barometers. And then areas where we see China having success that we think are sort of directly problematic for the region. The digital mass surveillance technologies, this concept of digital authoritarianism. Again, of a government that, when engaging with authoritarian regimes in Latin America or governments kind of leaning in that direction, is happy to provide the tools that enable repression and surveillance and undermine civil liberties. The idea that governments in Latin America sometimes find themselves more constrained in taking positions that the United States would think of as more consistent with democratic values in this region because of their relationships with China. The idea that non-alignment is now talked about very frequently, or active non-alignment, different formulations, but a specific notion that this region should not ally itself with the United States in U.S.-China competition. This is very fashionable right now in the region and a really strong signal to the United States that if there's a competition going on, well, if China hasn't won, certainly neither has the United States. And that Latin America seems very committed right now to a non-alignment approach, right? And that the tide is shifting in Latin America, and there's a lot of concern that this is opening up new opportunities for China, that when governments of a certain ideological orientation win elections, there could be much more openness to engaging with China. And so all of this kind of reinforcing these considerations for the United States and forcing the United States to frame its engagement in the context of great power competition. You see this increasingly said explicitly. So you no longer need people like me to say, okay, here's kind of what's really behind a lot of U.S. thinking, or you don't need to be at these meetings I've referred to where U.S. diplomats and senior officials are talking endlessly about China when engaging with officials here. But you can see it again in specific statements that come from the United States, such as the National Security Strategy from 2020 in the last administration that talked very specifically about these kind of new actors in the region and all the nefarious impacts they have here. And I don't want to make light of it because I think there is something to this, but it's very explicit now. right? Unfairly disadvantage the U.S., harm the environment, pressure nations to adopt policies inconsistent with democratic values. A really explicit statement about how the United States sees China engaging in the region. And a highly confrontational approach in that era, a less confrontational approach right now under the current U.S. administration, but fundamentally based on the same considerations, the same fears, and a use of similar tools to make a similar argument. And so under the current administration, the head, or the commander of the Southern Command, traveled recently, including to Argentina, and in an interview there mentioned particular infrastructure projects, including Chinese control of these ports in each end of the Panama Canal, as especially worrisome to the United States. And so I think, again, you're seeing a much more blunt and public assessment by various parts of the US government in acknowledging all of the things that I've just laid out that were usually said with much more subtlety, that were said with much more politeness and much more diplomatic attitudes. But now the vocabulary really is shifting as there's more, I think, consensus in the United States, more concern, more congressional interest in great power competition. And you see this even in this part of Latin America, maybe even particularly in this part of Latin America. And so in Argentina, your neighbor, you hear specific concerns about a Chinese space station in Neuquén, Argentina, and about the role of the People's Liberation Army in managing that facility. Rumors of a logistics hub in Ushuaia have become prominent in discussions of the United States-Argentina relationship, and then discussions in Argentina, Brazil, everywhere about Huawei 5G technology. And you see the United States, again, kind of trying to be, I think, a little bit more transparent and a little clearer in how it views this competition and acknowledging that it has, again, become the defining geostrategic challenge for this generation. And so in a speech that I'd recommend to anyone who's interested in this subject at, I think, Georgetown University in May of this year, the U.S. Secretary of State tried to kind of lay out the way the Biden administration sees this relationship between the United States and China, but you could extrapolate the way it would encourage other countries that are democratic are trying to sort out their relationship. And what he said was, we'll compete with confidence, cooperate wherever we can, and we'll contest where we must. Which means that the relationship U.S.-China, bilaterally, but including in areas like Latin America, will include competition, ideally some cooperation, but that it will be a complex and really defining challenge for the United States. And in that sense, it will be a defining challenge, I think, for a lot of governments throughout the world that are trying to sort out their relationships with Western Europe, with the United States, with China, to naturally and logically seek to have the most benefits from the relationship with both, while ideally also trying to be true to their own democratic values, which I think creates enormous complexity and challenge for this and coming generations of political figures and diplomats. And I think even Uruguay itself finds itself very much in the middle of this conversation, both domestically and in its relationships with China and the United States, as the free trade agreement conversation has again played, I think, an important role lately in reminding the United States once again of the presence of China in the region, its growing influence, of reminding the United States once again that China engages happily with countries even when they're governed by the center-right, and presumably democratic countries, places where you would think if there's anywhere that would be less interested in China, more interested in the United States, it would be a place like Uruguay today. And yet, not surprisingly, Uruguay is engaging in this free trade agreement discussion with China. And so it has served as a reminder of all of this. The reaction of the United States and the concerns you might be aware of, I think, has also reinforced what I'm describing as this kind of obsession with China in Latin America, and the debate domestically as well, about how you balance interests, values, economic imperatives. I think you can all see in this one kind of case study that I think is obviously relevant, I think, to this group, but helpful in understanding the kind of broader context. And even the degree and scale of this kind of China obsession in the United States Congress, in the State Department, in our embassies, in the White House, which goes across, again, political parties and across administrations, there's a lot of voices in Washington that think it's not enough. And that we're not thinking enough about China and Latin America. We're not dedicating enough tools to compete with China and Latin America. We're not aggressive enough in this competition. And then there's some who are saying, look, we need to acknowledge that this is akin to the Cold War, where Latin America was this battleground for influence in ways that I think guided U.S. policy direction in really negative and problematic ways, changed the tools the U.S. used, changed the amount of attention, but not for productive engagement. But just to let you know that despite all this intensity, there's plenty of voices that say, no, we're not focusing nearly enough and recognizing the national security and economic and future implications of letting China become such a major influence in this hemisphere, in this sensitive geography. And so I mentioned that to conclude, to say that if you think it couldn't get any more intense, and if you think it couldn't get any more sort of narrow in the framing of U.S. engagement in Latin America, it could and it probably will. And so those, both within the U.S. government and outside the U.S. government, who think for a variety of reasons, tactical and intellectual and cultural, that this shouldn't be the only framing, that Latin America and U.S. relationships should be moving in lots of different directions and motivated by lots of different factors, that the issues I spoke about at the very beginning of this conversation, that the U.S. genuine interest in fighting corruption, in supporting human rights, in reducing hunger, in promoting renewable energy, that all of those are motivations in and of themselves and should be the motivation for greater U.S. engagement and greater U.S. finance. And there's plenty of voices that say that, both, again, in the U.S. government and outside. And there's plenty of arguments tactically for why that's even a better approach to great power competition. Despite all that, you're probably going to be living in a world where, again, more and more of the conversations about great politics in the Western Hemisphere are centered around great power competition.